Thank you very much. Mr. Dixon, thank you very much for framing the discussion for us on DEI. The five of us are not from the insurance sector, but we are part of the financial services sector. And one of the issues that came out very clearly today is actually how connected these things are. And one of the desire in Hong Kong, and I think globally, is for us to learn about each other, because the impact of some of these so-called polycrises that are impacting us are coming far and wide. The title of the whole conference touches on stability and resilience, and I think these two words are now quite part of the common vocabulary that we are talking about, because I think you all know here how many things you have to deal with that are coming from left field, that are gray rhinos or black swans even. So today, we're going to introduce one more issue as a focus for our consideration. We already talked about talent. We talked about risk management. So the issue I want to introduce today to add to the richness of this conference is people. People in the sense of how our society changing. I also want to touch on the point that the financial secretary made at lunch, because after talking about the financial aspect of the insurance sector, he very clearly added a couple of sentences about social impact. Now, of course, talking about the insurance sector or the finance sector from a business point of view, about risk, investments, and so on, is very much part of what Hong Kong's, as a financial center, talks about. But of course, underlying everything are people. So we want to start the conversation today to understand demographic moves. And I can't think of anyone better than Professor Paul Yip. He is one of Hong Kong's best-known demographer. So to fit into the context of talking about social impact and people, I want to ask you, Paul, we kind of know low fertility and people are stressed, but can you give us a good summary of really what the demographic trends are, so that we have the backdrop to think about what it is that the financial services sector has to think about? So Paul, please.
Thank you, Christine. I think it's everything what we are talking about is relating to people, relating to us. I think nothing about us without us, so we have to learn a bit more about our population. If you can imagine, you have the climate change in an island with no people, there's no problem, right? So we have to understand the people first. Now in Hong Kong, and at a global level, I think we are experiencing so-called the aging problem. But the problem is you age, I age, right? No big deal. But the problem we are talking about, it is the rate and the magnitude. I think in Hong Kong, everything goes fast. It only takes 25 years, I mean, to double our aging population. Whereas France, take them 100 years. So when you can see the window to respond to the aging is very narrow. So for some reason, I think we can excuse the Hong Kong government is not doing so well. It is because just the time is very short. At the same time, we are talking about the magnitude as well. We are talking about the increase of amount of the elderly population from 1.47 million people. I think it is expected to go to 2.74, I think in 20 years down the road. Can we cope? Are we ready for that? Now that is the aging problem. Then the second, I think we are talking about we live longer, but not necessarily healthier. Our life expectancy has been increasing about 2 or 3 months per year. So for men, I think we live up to 83, 84. For the women, I think they live up to 89 now. However, when you're looking at what we call the disability life 3 years, 60% of the gain that we are live with disease burden. So what it means, we have about 3 years gain from 2014 to 2020, but among these 3 years, 60% of them, we are somehow with some kind of disability. So what it means, we can anticipate, I think the social welfare burden, the hospital burden, I think will be a lot. For the insurance, you have to think a bit more. I think when people live longer itself, I think the hospitalization rate will be disproportionately increased. Thirdly, we are talking about no health without mental health. You're talking about resilience. Well, we're talking about not only financial resilience, we're talking about mental health resilience too. You know, in Hong Kong, 1 in 7, according to the survey, have some kind of mental health problem. So you guys think about it, okay? We have 5 here, we are okay, okay? 2 are over there. And also, the number of people, I think, who go to receive their mental health problem have doubled in the last decade. So what we are talking about, we have to how to face this so-called mental health tsunami. That is something we have to deal with. I always say that, I think, young people, I mean, you must heard about, the mental health are not very good this day, and then 1 in 4, I think they still have this mental health problem. So I think with this background, I think just to tell you that I think the future, yes, we have a future, but it will be challenging. Thank you.
Right. So I think the point that you're really making is, with the context of all these types of policy crises that are also happening, it is stressing us out. And therefore, if we included the front row, we're already out 1 in 7. We're already in trouble. So what can the insurance sector do? Farnam, you are with one of the biggest global banks, HSBC. This sort of stuff that Paul is talking about, I mean, how do you look at it as an intermediator of capital?
First of all, thank you so much for having me today, and thanks for the Insurance Authority for organizing such a fantastic conference. I think the reality is, I mean, and it was alluded to, some of these crises have been going on for quite some time around the world, right? So we have seen the drop in working age population already affecting a number of countries, and as a result, the correlating drop in potentially GDP and productivity. We're seeing our clients react to this in different ways. I mean, this is also closely connected to the investments that we're seeing in technology, and particularly also in artificial intelligence, to be able to potentially offset some of this drop in labor productivity. But I think more broadly, we're seeing it kind of underpin an increased prioritization of ensuring that you have access to the widest possible pool of talent out there, and that you're creating an environment in which you are attracting and retaining talent consistently. And so this is really the kind of impetus for a lot of our clients to put a focus on diversity and inclusion, and it's why we're increasingly seeing diversity and inclusion as a material investment risk when we're looking at our clients and when we're supporting our clients in capital markets. I think as a result, you start to see a lot more investments in human capital development and programs in which people can train and maintain talent throughout their organizations because they're trying to battle this broader societal challenge that we have around the decline in working age populations. It also means that our clients are increasingly thinking about their products and services and how those products and services can thrive in a society where demographics are changing. If I think about ourselves from HSBC as a retail bank, we have made a huge focus over the course of the past few years on ensuring that we're expanding the inclusivity of our financial services. And that means something like here in Hong Kong, we've looked at 8 different minority groups that might be vulnerable when it comes to financial inclusion, and thinking about how can we tailor our services to ensure that they feel included. Everyone thinks about diversity and they think about genders, and as Dr. Farnam noted, and it's true that we have made a big focus on supporting female entrepreneurs and for supporting female-owned businesses, but actually our view on diversity and inclusion is much broader than just gender. We're also thinking about demographic diversity in terms of age and how you're your access to financial services changes over time as you grow older. We're looking at how we can expand access to people with physical and mental disabilities, people with dementia, for instance. And so how can we make sure that our services are as inclusive as possible? And this isn't just HSBC, as I said. When I look across our clients, they're thinking about it in terms of their products and services. They're also thinking about it increasingly in terms of their supply chains. That's the other big trend that we've seen is, more and more our clients thinking about how can I make sure, again, to protect my supply chain, to make it the most resilient supply chain as possible, that I'm ensuring that it's also a diverse supply chain in terms of who I'm sourcing from.
Right. So actually, whilst we have these poly-crises, there are risks, but there are also opportunities. And if you do your services well, what you're really saying is you're really serving your customers, and that's a good business proposition. So Gabriel, maybe I can come to you. As, again, a global investment company, what about in the investment sector?
Sure, and thanks a lot for the question, Christine. I think that if I think about the way demographic changes or D&I impact an investment space, I like to step back and look at what it means from a fundamental perspective. So effectively, what we're talking about is a change in the size, location, or composition of a population. What that means is that you have a change in demand for raw materials, for products and services, which can lead to huge disruptive change across various industries, the size of different demand, as was highlighted. The importance of the healthcare sector is going to increase massively in some countries. In other locations, what we're seeing is a huge demand for primary education and other elements as the population goes through a different phase of its maturation. And so what this means is, as a long-term investor, we really need to be very mindful about how this is changing not only the demand for investment products, but also the long-term competitive advantage and financial viability of the companies that we're investing in on behalf of our clients. So there's really two angles to this. One is around how it changes profit pools and what that means for fundamental investing. At Fidelity International, we have 180, 200 analysts that are looking at this every day, trying to find out how to come up with good investments within their space, taking into account environmental, social, and governance issues that fundamentally impact the viability of business. And on the other hand, it's how can we create products which are going to meet the emerging needs of our clients. And this could be life cycle investment products. It could be products that are focused actually on themes such as demographic change so that you can invest in some of the opportunities that this is going to create. And it is also looking at, from that fundamental perspective, what does excellence within a business look like over a long-term time horizon? The question of talent retention and also the ability to tailor products to meet different demographics and different parts of a society. If you don't reflect the society in which you operate within your own business, that can represent a long-term risk to how you can position and operate yourself. So when we think about this with an investment hat on, it really is about those different profit pools and how the products and services can shift. And resilience really is the key word here. And this is where insurance plays an absolutely critical role in trying to mitigate some of those risks of change and also to provide that insurance for retiring, healthcare, other sorts of expenses which might be unexpected.
Well, we'll want to hear more about that later, but if I can come to Chitra. You were with MSCI, a very well-known global rating agency, and when you talk to perhaps particularly your clients in Asia, are these types of issues now flowing to the top?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here and adding to the diversity of this panel. I wanted to touch on a couple of topics. So we've got a lot of data at MSCI, and we've been sort of collecting that data with a view, an ESG lens, if you like, for more than 20 years. So I'm going to try and encapsulate a couple of data points that might hit the point home as to how it makes a difference to any business. So on the aging part, very recently, I was presenting, this was at the PRI, this was in Tokyo, very recently. One of the data points that we had unearthed is because the culture, and this is also equally important when you're looking at demographics, in Japan tends to have people that join a company for a very long time. They're lifers, or they just tend to join a company and stay. They had very few engagement statistics in those companies. to actually pinpoint why is it that anyone stayed, or what made them happy, or what made them more engaged. And with the net result that now with the aging population, there is a war for talent in Japan, for young talent in Japan. And now they don't have enough statistics to show why is it that people come and join our company. It's not good enough to say we're the best or we're the biggest. I think they have to come to a deeper sense of purpose. And having that, if you're looking at demographics, if you're looking at the younger population, now that's become a business risk, not having had those engagement statistics in place. And they're scrambling now to get a bit more data on what is it that brings people to us. Again, sticking with Japan, we co-created an index back in 2016, which was about Women's Empowerment Index. Now you might wonder what was the thinking behind that all the way back in 2016. But at the time, GPIF, their sovereign wealth fund, was looking at the population, the working population, and could see very well that they were going to have an issue with getting talent. And so bringing women back to the workforce was one of the key drivers of creating that index. So we pulled together all the statistics we could, about 6 different metrics that we had to look at companies and assess to see whether they would qualify to be in the index. And they seed funded it, and we kicked it off. And it's been one of those key factors where I think companies have realized, oh, if we actually looked at these key factors and metrics, it would be, a lot more profitable for us to actually be in that index and be invested in. So I think that kick-started a change of behavior, if you like. And it were very simple things. It was literally looking at, mentorship for women and programs for women coming back to work, those sort of things. So I think, and then final point I wanted to make on demographics, I think you mentioned this location, another place that we can sort of look at how diverse is it that when you take a look at your pool. And certainly there, I think there is, in COP, there was a discussion between the global north and the global south, looking at just transition, looking at all of these issues that then look at the flow of capital and the deployment of capital, how equitable that is. And in that, I would say definitely there's a lot to be done on diversity. And also for innovation, I would argue that some of the decentralized options that are coming through innovation and the new solutions, they come from the third world for the third world. So I think if the funding is not geared up for that, then you're not going to find the most scalable or suitable solutions for some of these countries that have the most need, in fact, when it comes to climate change.
Well, maybe I can just share with the audience that I know the 2 ladies have actually just come back from COP28. So, Chitra, maybe before I go back to Paul, I just want to ask the 2 of you, since you've just come back and you started to talk about the discussion there, can you maybe say a little bit more, be a bit more specific? Because it's supposed to be a climate change gathering, but actually to deal with climate change, which affects everybody, it seems like people are taking up some of these issues. Can you go a little bit more into details? And then Farnam, I want to ask you before I go back to Paul, please.
Sure. This is actually great because I can justify why not firing on all cylinders, been a lack of sleep for the last 7 days. This COP was actually very inclusive, if I can say that. It had a lot of representation from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, more than what I've experienced in previous COPs. I think certainly in Glasgow. And I also think what helped was the fact that they had made sure there was room for some dialogues, which I wasn't really sure how they were going to do it in that space, but they still had activists, they had, controlled protests, I would say. So again, very inclusive, allowing for a lot of opinions to be shared. There was, as ever, obviously there was a finance day, which is how I was there and Farnam was there, I imagine, but also there was a gender day, which was, overlapping on the same day as finance. So there were lots of discussions that involved both gender and finance overlapping on the same day, as well as separate discussions. And I thought that was quite evolved because I do remember a few years ago when neither were top of the agenda. There was also the indigenous population discussion. I think that was 2 days ago. And finally, Energy Day, I did want to mention, including the Middle East in these discussions has been pivotal. I think you can't have a talk about energy transition or the energy mix in the world unless you include them in the discussion without making them feel vilified. So I think this was a key turning point for them to take center stage and talk about what they were willing to do, fully acknowledging that they have had the power of having a lot of energy in their hands, fossil fuels namely, and having built an oasis in the middle of nowhere, and also huge economies to scale on the strength and on the back of the finance that came out of this oil industry. And then saying, well, now we're ready to make a change. Now we're ready to help the world shift to a 1.5 degree world, let's say, and make that a reality. So it was amazing, and I'm going to leave some space for Farnam to add.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The kind of the scale of this COP, and we were reflecting on this, sort of going back sort of 15 years of going to COP, that the scale was unprecedented. You had 80,000 people ascending on Dubai, and the agenda was also one of the most inclusive. I mean, in addition to the days that Chitra mentioned, it was also the first time that there was a dedicated day for health. And I think, coming back to, this discussion today and what we're talking about in terms of changes in demographic, that's critical, right? Because climate change is a systemic risk, and the impacts that it's going to have on, population health and population productivity are significant. One of the things that struck me, listening to some panels on that day, was, the fact that 1 in 12 hospitals globally are expected to be impacted by the severe weather impacts that might come upon us if we don't meet the goal of 2 degrees. 490 billion hours of productivity lost across agriculture, manufacturing, and services in 2022 because of extreme heat already. And that's, even before we hit any of those tipping points that we're trying to mitigate against. So I think, the conversation really demonstrated the way in which climate kind of amplifies and underpins a lot of the risks that we're talking about today. I was really encouraged by the announcements that were made with regards to climate finance, because so many of them talked about these polycrises and the underpinning, the systemic risk that climate faces. So we had the Loss and Damage Fund, 700 million so far of commitments. Maybe we'll see more before the final text is finalized next week. That is going to go towards increasing resilience and adaptation. And also within the 30 billion that was announced through the new Altera Fund, largely seeded by the UAE, there was again a reference to ensuring a just transition, ensuring that there's at least 5 billion towards concessionary finance that will go towards emerging markets to help them adapt against the impacts of the transition. So I think it was, what we saw last week, and what I hope you'll see in the final agreement, is a real recognition of the kind of the ways in which the climate intersects with a lot of the other risks that we're talking about today.
Right, thank you. Paul, maybe I can come back to you. Maybe before you share, I want to share a story with you that I just heard last night. The Minister for Investment from Saudi Arabia is in Hong Kong to participate in the forum that I think was mentioned earlier on. And he talked about the last few years in Saudi Arabia, and they needed to increase their workforce because there was a lot more economic activity, and they identified that since a lot of Saudi women were not part of the workforce, that this was a tremendous human resource that they should focus on. So, Paul, I mean, when we're looking at how to deal with these kinds of issues, I think you have probably thought about perhaps ways, how do we deal with these crises? Share some examples with us.
Well, I think we do have a shortage of the workforce, and that's why the government is very keen on to bring in some foreign or these skilled laborers, to come to offset our shortages. The other thing, but we have to fully bear in mind, is everybody is looking for some young, very skillful, and rich migrants, right? Hong Kong is fighting for it, Australia is fighting for it, right? So we really have to work hard on ourselves, how to make sure that we are attractive enough, appealing enough. We are very fortunate to bring Gabriel to come to Hong Kong. I mean, he stayed in Hong Kong for 9 years from Australia. So we do need more Gabriels to come here. Right? And the other thing, I think we also have to work hard to try to reduce, I think, the outflow of our people. I mean, so in the last 2 or 3 years, we do have seen an outflow of the people. So I think if we can try to address the concern, I think that would be helpful as well. And then when you talk about the release, I think the workforce of the women, yes, I think in Hong Kong, I think we do not have a very adequate childcare services. I think we are still talking about the working participation rate is still about 50%. But our fertility rate is not very high anyway, But when you compare in the Western country, I mean in Nordic countries, I think the fertility rate is about 1.8. We have only 0.7. But their working participation rate is 80%. So I think it really goes back to ourselves, whether we create a family-friendly, gender-friendly working environment, such that we really can release our workforce. In our university, I think the first-year student, there are more female students than male students. However, when you're looking at the workforce participation rate, after the age 35, I think the women working participation has dropped. Because these professional, young talents, women, they have to make a choice whether they pursue their academic, they pursue their career development or the family formation. Very unfortunately, I mean, we are not giving them a choice. They have to somehow, they make a compromise, which is highly undesirable and somehow is waste of our human capital. So I think we somehow, if we can create an environment which the women can really bring the best out of them, and I think that can address at least part of our labor shortage problem.
Well, I have a question for you, Paul, but just to remind everybody, if you would like to raise some comments or ask some questions, please type it in. Now, Paul, here is a question for you. We're talking about Hong Kong specifically, where the retirement age is 65, and the question really is, well, at 65, people are quite healthy. They like to work for longer. Well, what do you think of that?
I think our retirement age, the government retirement age is at the age of 60, right? So it is very true. When we're looking at our demographic transition, those who are age 60 now, they are as good as 40, 20 years ago, right? So I think we should, given the choice, the option, for the people, I think if they like to retain or to stay in the workforces. Now, of course, there's some people, they think that, well, when you are there, and then the people, they cannot move up, So I'm sure there will be some arrangement, can be done, which can address the concern of the mobility of the younger generation, but at the same time, I think retained this sort of professional, or this sort of, the people that can still remain in the workforce. Because I think when you're looking at our health trajectory, we do not hit 60 and drop dead, right? We are not that, right? We go like that. But the insurance company, unfortunately, you take the people like this. After age 60 or after age 65, you might increase the premium disproportionately. And it actually is quite a hurdle, I think, for some company to retain this so-called the not-so-young working population.
All right, well, that is a point for the insurance sector to take on. Gabriel, there's a lot of talk about ESG investing, and I think you mentioned it just now. So perhaps give us some examples of how you're blending these factors into putting investment products together.
So there's two sides to it from an investment landscape. There's a risk side and there's an opportunity side. So if we're thinking about risk, it really comes down to economic resilience and tail risk and attracting and retaining the best talent to remain competitive. This is one of the things that we see if we're looking at workforce participation, if we're looking at the diversity of a workforce. What that tells an investor is, have you been able to attract the talent from the widest possible pool to get the best possible people into a role? And so if you lack the angle on diversity within your workforce, it immediately raises a question as to what are you trying to achieve with your business? Is it the best quality outcomes for stakeholders, or is it limited by some other factors? So that's more on the risk side around trying to evaluate it from a resilience of workforce. There's also elements, as we were talking about with population shifts, with climate change, with other ESG issues, that can result in tail risk events, whether this could be reputation of the company, it could be product issues or other sorts of challenges or corporate governance challenges that could result in a step change in valuation or corporate value, enterprise value. So that's the risk side. That's what we're trying to avoid. This is the way it's typically integrated into the most amount of money in the market and the most traditional products. On the opportunity side, it's looking at some very, very specific products. So, for example, at Fidelity International, we have a demographics fund, which is effectively looking at how profit pools are being destroyed and created as a way of identifying fantastic long-term investments for our clients. So that's looking at elements like healthcare, like education, like some of these other issues that we were talking about, and taking a long-term view about what that does to profit pools and competitive advantage. There's also associated ESG topics around random themes, such as there's climate, there's a lot of different elements around social, technology, other automation enablers, and some other comments around those topics, which effectively are trying to identify which sectors are going to have structural tailwinds as a result of some of these ESG issues, and trying to position a portfolio to benefit from them. And then I lied, I'll give you a third one. I said there'd be two. The third is just around the individual products that our clients are demanding. So those two buckets that I highlighted have been around for a long period of time. As we see people working for longer, living for longer, the types of products that they're looking for in terms of income protection or longer dated assets, or the styles of funds that automatically shift their allocation as the beneficiary ages, we're seeing a huge amount of uptick in demand for some of those more exotic products that typically weren't part of a lot of investment portfolios. So again, a breadth of diversification and a breadth of structuring that is coming into the market.
Well, there's a general question really for the three of you on the business side. The question is how ESG generates business value, but maybe I can add on ESG as well as DEI. If you can try and put this in more specific terms about business value. Who would like to go first? Or put it in some way that will help us to see that these things are going to stay and these things can generate business value and they're good for business. Some examples. Chitra, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can talk about. So we come out with a lot of research, and that's what MSCI does. We're a research and data house, and so we've created a series of reports, the Women on Boards report that comes out every year in March. And what we've been doing is tracking not just the sheer number of women on boards, but then also looking at the age factor, at what age do they enter boards, and what's done, in fact, to build up that pipeline of women on boards. And so it actually starts a lot earlier. Without the right experience at the right age and being introduced to it, they don't build up that confidence in governance, which they then need when they're being popped onto boards. So it has been touted as something that is like a retirement job and end of your professional life sort of job. And we're sort of now seeing a trend where you have younger board members, and that's more because there's a war for talent again. It's because in some countries there's now a regulation, you have to have a woman on your board, and so they're scrambling to find women on board. So that, I think, in a way has been positive. And what we see on the back of that is the actual performance of these companies, which we've been tracking as well. So has it made any difference to have a woman on the board? I think what we've come to the conclusion that it takes more than one woman on the board to make that difference. The magic number is apparently 3, just sharing that for everyone. And it's also, I think, looking at age, again, I would say on the board, what we're seeing now is a trend, particularly in some sectors, to have younger people on the board, purely because you can't project your strategy into the future if you don't have anyone that's invested in the future to actually be on those boards. So I think this is also having some inclusion in decision-making and bringing them in at a very strategic level.
Right, I think this is a difficult question, and that's why I want to press it, right? Because we've probably all argued before, these are nice to have, and sometimes these diversity issue, they start in the West, and these are considered more friendly kind of policies to have. But whether you can then show there's a business case to it, or is it about a business case? I mean, you know, responsible business. I think it's correct to ask, what is the business case, and in which areas are we beginning to see that these are not just nice to have? Gender and age can be difficult, but there are probably some other areas. Farnam?
Yeah, I think that's critical, right? Is that we talk about ESG. ESG is an umbrella term that refers to many different factors across each of those dimensions of environmental, social, and governance, right? We're focusing today on diversity and inclusion. There's obviously a significant impact when it comes to climate, then again on waste, on water usage. There's so many, and it will be different for every business, what the business case is. Generally, from an HSBC perspective, we think about it in terms of a few major mechanisms where we then see it follow through on business value. I mean, one is, and Gabriel's put it perfectly, is around that question of profit pools, right? How is this building out revenues? And I think something interesting that we find is, you know, a lot of these initiatives and programs, they may start as a way to attract, you know, a certain segment of the market. So for instance, you know, when I think about the food and beverage industry, a lot of the work that has been done over the course of the past decade to build more sustainable products, you know, with more traceable products, was initially done to attract a certain consumer base. Over time, that has now flowed through to regulation, and now that's really a piece around regulatory resilience of a company, right? And protecting a position in the market rather than just reaching out to a certain kind of consumer. And I think we see a lot of examples of that, right? That these things begin in the voluntary space and then trickle into regulatory resilience. And so the companies that have been focusing on them and sort of foreseen them earlier are much better positioned in the long term. The other transmission mechanisms that we look at are around operational expenditures. And so we do see that there are a number of sustainability factors that have a direct impact on the costs of a business. So, you know, the one that everyone thinks about is the cost of energy, the cost of resources. But you can also think about, in the context of DE&I, the cost of recruitment, right? And the cost of bringing someone into the business rather than developing talent throughout your organization. And that can be quite significant. Over time, we also think that there's an impact through taxation, through subsidies, through the cost of capital more broadly. And we're starting to see that play quite significantly in some industries. I don't need to, the obvious one is obviously oil and gas is already facing a higher cost of capital. Tobacco, you know, is now facing a much higher cost of capital than what you would expect based on the credit quality of those companies because of ESG considerations. So those are the ways that we look at it in order to really pinpoint how does it fit into valuations. And like I said, I think the critical thing is to step away from that umbrella term of ESG and think about what's material to this business and what is going to flow through to, you know, the actual balance sheet.
Well, I have a general question here again about technology. How do you look at technology and data and, you know, all those kind of digital-related technology? How do you see this impacting on DE&I issue? Gabriel, you want to go first? And then I think, Paul, you have a sense of how you look at this. Gabriel?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting question because there are a huge range of impacts and directions we could go with that. So if I look at technology and the evolution of technology, there's a few different ways I can see it impacting. One is really enabling a geographically dispersed workforce. In terms of, as we found out during COVID, you can work from home effectively. Different organisations have taken different approaches to the flexibility that they're providing. If we think about what that means for someone that may have mobility impairments or other sorts of challenges, does that open up different options for different people to actually be more balanced in the way that they're able to contribute to a specific role? Similarly, if we're looking at workforce participation, the ability to work from home one day a week could be a game changer in workforce participation and other sorts of issues. So I think that technology has a huge ability as an enabler. And this is down to other sorts of challenges that we were discussing around how does each individual country, region, location address these challenges. and there's not necessarily one right solution here. If we look at some markets, they've decided that high quality immigration or immigration is a fantastic way to address a labour or skills gap that might exist within a country. If we look at Japan, they've taken a completely different approach in terms of looking at how automation and technology can fill some of those gaps. And so I think that it does potentially create a lot of opportunities, but then also has the added impact of potentially creating dislocation within some sectors through ChatGPT, other forms of technology, resulting in displacement of certain jobs or workforces, which could impact certain segments of the economy based on socioeconomic status and other elements more or less than others. So incredibly broad topic, and apologies for going down a rabbit hole on that a little bit, but I do think there are a wide range of areas where it can contribute.
Right, but no, I think that was very important contribution, and I think all three of you mentioned something that relates to public policy. You know, something can come from outside your jurisdiction, something can come from the private sector, but then eventually, to what extent do the governments of their jurisdiction decide to prioritize? That will then have an impact on the whole of society. So maybe riding on this point, Paul, because you've spent a long time thinking about policy, you know, both in terms of technology and both in terms of policies to deal with some of these demographic issues that you've shared with us.
Well, this morning, I think we have a retreat of the university. I think we are talking about how AI will affect the university education. You know? I mean, now if we embrace the AI, do we not need that many professors in the university now? No? You can ask the ChatGPT on everything, right? So, but what we really think that I think that the latest technology, I think, is really ask us to scale up the game. You know, it has led us to embrace, I think, the latest development and which can facilitate our work. Some daunting tasks, I mean, now we can release it. I think we can get the people, I think, to do something even more creatively. I think now we are talking about the use of big data, and then it will reduce the idle time, reduce the wastage, and all are good things. Now, because we are not going to be able to replace our working population, our women, they are not going to produce a lot of baby, I mean, despite the goodwill of the government to give this incentive. But what we really want to do is just to help our current workforce to be more productive. Now, when we say more productive, it doesn't mean that we work longer. We work very long already, right? We do not need to be work even longer, but we need to work smart, and then that is where we can use the technology. And when we use the automation, and these are very important. But then, go back to the very, very basic. We have to invest on the education. I think education of our workforce. Now, it's not only the young people. We are talking about the lifelong education. We are talking about the middle-aged one or the even not so young one. I think if they still have the good health, I think they embrace this, and then I think they still can continue to make them to be a productive member. So I think education and education and education, and make the education interesting. I think it's very important. At this moment, I have heard about a lot of complaints about our curriculum, our education. We do not make it very interesting, and we do not make it very creative. So if you really want to create a workforce can embrace the future changes, then we have to start to invest on the education and start from the primary. Start not to the university. The university, they can't help much. I mean, this guy, they don't come to the lectures anyway. You know? So you have to, because they can learn by themselves. If you nurture, I think the sense of learning, I mean, we always believe, teach less, they learn more. So, but the importance of nurturing the curiosity and then this sort of mindset, I think there's a crucial for our future development.
Right, so I understand the organizers would like to ask you all a question that you can vote on. So whilst they get ready, are you ready to put the question up? Now the question is, and please use your mobile phone, what would you do next to take forward DEI initiatives in your company? Now what they're doing here is they're giving you two answers, and let's see which two you choose. So then the panel, I'd like you to comment on the choices that people are making from your experience. So let's give this a minute whilst you make your choice. Yes, everyone has voted. Very good, almost. I think this is interesting. Now, the companies that are here, I mean, I think I've got 3 companies here that have D&I policies. What do you think of the results?
So,
And what does it mean in terms
Yeah.
of, for example, corporate culture and D&I? What does it mean from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of comes to my gut instinct response to this, is that the first one is actually very challenging. And I think people think that it's quite straightforward, but I think the reality is a real corporate culture that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion is much more challenging than simply putting in some targets or otherwise. And I think Chitra touched on this quite well when talking about MSCI's research on women on boards. The fact that, I think the target that companies most often start with when they think about a corporate culture on D&I is they say, well, let me start with the tone from the top. Let me start with women on boards, women in the C-suite. And actually, I think the academic research mostly finds that it's actually women in senior management, so it's that kind of middle level that is most impactful in changing a culture and making it more inclusive, and that's because that's the culture that people experience day in, day out in their work. Do they feel like they can speak up? Do they feel like they have opportunities for promotion? Do they feel as if their ideas are being heard? And so developing that culture, and this is one of the challenges that I think that we all have, is how do you measure for it? You're often using these kind of crude inputs when what you're trying to get to is quite a complex output that Paul also described quite well, is that real culture of inclusivity.
There's a book, I think, that says Culture Eats Strategy or something like that. So that was a clear proof point of that. I would say, certainly from a D&I perspective, to Farnam's point, it's complex, but you have to create to have a culture that really permeates the core of your business. So I think one of the things, if the company happens to be one that's focused on innovation, it's an easier point to make, because what you're trying to do is bring together as many perspectives as possible, and that towards the end goal is like the best, sort of outcome you could get. I think for some other companies where there has been, perhaps from a sectoral perspective, a culture that has been very, very strong, it's much harder to change the culture within, say, a manufacturing base, certainly utility companies, and so many others, so non-tech related, where you haven't always had a very young workforce. I think there's an existing culture that then needs to shift. And that takes a lot of time, effort, and work. And it's much more than just describing at the very top what your vision or mission might be. It's actually changing how you work and helping everyone bring their authentic selves to work. And that's a hard thing to do globally. So I'd say for global companies particularly, you might be able to do it on a local basis, but have that work out globally, it is a generational work, I think, that you have to set out to do. It takes more than a decade to say we truly live our culture.
Right. I guess there's a kind of global, this is part of a global discussion, but in every society there's a local discussion. And we all have some local context in what we need to do in the area that we operate in. So what inclusion, equity, diversity means locally, so for example, if it is about a younger workforce, but that younger workforce, you've all shared with us that actually it's a strategic issue that you've got to deal with. It isn't just something that is nice to have. So maybe you can also add in your discussion about government policies. How do you see these blending in? So perhaps Gabriel and then Paul.
So building on some of the comments, I think that I would definitely agree that corporate culture can be very challenging to change, but is very powerful if it does. I've seen personal examples and examples from friends in the industry where people have deliberately not chosen to work at organisations after being offered a job because they felt like they wouldn't have the same progression opportunities because of their personal characteristics, preferences, you name it, background. And I feel like that is, as everyone becomes more mobile, and it's very easy. We've got very international, diverse workforces in a lot of countries and a lot of markets. I think that culture becomes a critical element of driving continued business success and attracting talent. And increasingly, a younger generation is voting with their feet as to what they want to consume, where they want to work, and often that's coming back to a lot of elements around the characteristics and values of those organisations. So I think that's critical. Point two, I've actually seen some really good examples of that being used to get buy-in from senior management as a way of trying to start the conversation at the board, even though it needs to permeate the organisation. And so if I think of what could potentially support this from more of a policy standpoint or policy objective, I am personally a fan of what Hong Kong Exchange and others have done within the region in terms of trying to promote diversity through regulation and trying to make sure that you do have some champions and also mentors that are being put into those places which can have effective leadership and drive culture change within an organisation. I think that it's difficult. I'm not a policy expert, so I don't want to go too far into this. I'll definitely leave that for others, but I think that there's also an opportunity around the enablers that Paul was mentioning around childcare, around other sorts of aspects which can help make it more of a personal choice and not a victim of circumstance as to what is driving some of these outcomes.
Right, Paul, you have the last word. We have about 2 minutes left.
Well, I think the DEI is a good thing. I think, but if you do the DEI just for the sake to meet this criteria, I think that will go to another extremes. I think that if we provide a fair playing ground for everyone, I think let everyone to compete, and then that should be fair. We do aware for the women's, I think for the sexual minority or the EM, they do have the disadvantage. But this disadvantage is very structural. So we have to address this more structural problem. I think like the language barriers, then we have to do it well during the school time. I mean, which should provide this opportunity for them to learn the different languages and to equip them, I think, to be in a job. So I am for equity, I am for diversity, I'm for inclusion. But if you just, because I need to make up the numbers, I just want to make up enough women sitting in a board, and then I'm sorry, I do have some problem with that. I do apologize for that. But another thing I like to argue about this ESG. I mean, now it's a lot about the buzzword to talk about the ESG, the social. But one thing is very important. It is not when we earn the money and then we donate some money out, that is called the social value. That's a very low level of the social value. I think at a high level we are talking about is while I'm doing my business, how can I be more responsible? How can I be more sensitive to the needs of my employees? How can I treat my employees better? I think these are the very important things. So when we talk about the ESG now, I know that it will become a big business. I think there are a lot of people that are talking about. But if we just also addressing as a very superficial value, I think the add value for the whole thing, it is not much. So I do feel that I think we should develop a more empathetic mindset to try to understand each other, to be a more caring persons, and then to provide equal grounds, I think, for everyone.
Well, I'll just summarize by saying that my experience is because of these fast changes, these challenges that are coming at us globally, that affects us locally, one of the things it seems like we all have to do is learn new tricks. So for us professors, doing climate change, climate science, we're now having to talk to bankers. Bankers want to understand risk and what it means on a physical level. We're also talking about the social impact on people. What does it mean about migration and about perhaps certain areas of the world that are no longer farmable? We're talking about younger people, talking about demography, how our societies are changing, how our partners in other parts of the world that we do business in, how they are changing, and what are the policies that we need from government's perspective, what collaboration we have to do with others and within our society, as well as to make people better so that we're more productive, so that we're healthier, so that well-being becomes something that is real rather than box ticking. So please put your hands together to thank my panel for their contribution.